All right, we're up at the up at the Upper Museum at the old Bardstown Village here now. We've got a little bit more here of some war history that we've looked at, and it doesn't include just the Civil War. This part's a little more into different wars that people have participated in, not necessarily just from Bardstown, but Bardstown memorabilia as well. We've got Dr. Mickey Anderson here with us, and Dr. Anderson, you've well, I've been in your office, and it's pretty much a museum in itself. And so I know you've got a lot of things down there. You've been a big history buff for many years, been involved. Matter of fact, I think right now involved in doing a movie on history. So history is sort of part of your life.
It has been for a long period of time, and particularly now that I'm part of it. And you're not too far behind me. So.
No. Yeah, I'm getting historical every. I'm getting more be more of an artifact every day. So. What got you into it?
When I was very small, probably around 9 years old, my grandfather took a trip to Gettysburg and brought back a little tiny plaque with 2 bullets on it for me as a souvenir. Mm-hmm. And it just fascinated me that something that old still existed. So that actually is still in my office. I've kept it since 1963. And that just started me keeping an eye on things. And back at that time period, you could find all kinds of artifacts for nothing, just pennies on the dollar. So I started collecting things, and it, as most things do, got out of hand. And I now have more things than I know what to do with.
Well, I've never met anybody in my life that have so many different passions as you've got. Not only as a surgeon, but in this war museum. I mean, opera singer. I mean, there's things that people may not know about you, and that may be another story for another day. But what do we got here? I know you say this is one of the oldest artifacts that you were able to collect.
Well, this is actually a naval ensign's dress coat that, based on the buttons, the maker's buttons, and the fact that it's completely hand sewn, dates from the Mexican War period. I found that in a costume shop of all places when I was on one of the rare vacations that I go on, and they actually were renting it out as a costume, and I looked at it and kind of recognized what it was and asked them if they would be willing to sell it, and they made me an offer that was probably 10% of its value, and I let the buyer beware, so I snatched it up and had my good friend Jack Harrison look at it, who confirmed that it was Indian or Mexican War period. And as I mentioned to you earlier, it has the officer's name handwritten in ink on the inside, which once I reach retirement, I will take that and try and research it a little bit. But so far, it's an enigma.
1840, so I doubt if he's around, but he might have some family still going around here somewhere. Well, there's all kinds of stuff because this dragoon sword. What can you tell me about something like that?
Well, that is an 1840 pattern sword. And that same type of dragoon sword existed well up past the Civil War. They tended to be fairly heavy. They were used more as bludgeons than they were swords. The cavalry would use those to knock people down more than actually pierce them or cut them. These type swords generally have very little edge on them. They're fairly blunt. But they make excellent clubs.
Well, war was fought so differently back in those days than they are now. Obviously, now we push a button and somebody thousands of miles away gets the consequences of it. But this was up close and personal back then.
This was very personal. This was face to face. Still using Napoleonic tactics at this time, which extend well up into the Civil War period, which basically wound up being 2 lines of men that would march up to each other and shoot until someone ran away.
Hated to be in the first line.
Hate to be in the first line, and I'm sure they did too. But it was a fairly primitive form of warfare, which existed long after the weaponry had gotten far better than the tactics. And that accounts for a lot of the casualties in the American Civil War. the commanders were still using Napoleonic tactics, which brought troops within 50 to 100 yards of each other with weapons that were accurate out to 400, 500, and 600 yards.
Yeah.
So it wound up being a bloodbath most of the time.
Yeah, so it took a little while for the mentality to catch up to technology, I guess. What other kind of stuff you have in this museum? I know you've donated several things here.
I have a helmet collection in the back, primarily of First World War helmets that I've picked up along the way. We also have Admiral Inouye's uniform in the back. Admiral Inoue was a Japanese admiral during the Second World War that was in charge of the Naval Air Command under Admiral Yamamoto, and was very intimately involved in the planning of the Pearl Harbor attack, and his dress whites are back.
How would you get a hold of his uniform?
I have some contacts in Japan, and there are a number of Americans that live in Japan that are associated with the military, and they go around scavenging things up. And this uniform actually has his name embroidered on the inside, so those that can read kanji, and I'm not one of them, but have translated that for us and identified the uniform.
So you got World War I. I mean, you mentioned we've talked about World War II, but World War I, you say you got some memorabilia that we don't hear a lot about World War I. I don't know if it's because people have passed away or just didn't get the press that World War II got, but there was a lot. That was a pretty bloody war in itself.
In terms of gruesomeness, it far exceeds the Second World War. The reason, I think, part of the reason that we in the United States don't hear so much about it is the First World War started in 1914, and there literally were millions of casualties before the United States even became involved. The United States did not commit any troops to Europe during World War I until late 1917, when the tide of the war had essentially changed at that point, and it was fairly certain that the Axis powers were going to be defeated. There was still a long way to go, and the United States did contribute significantly to the Allies winning the war, but the majority of the war was fought by the British and the French.
Well, I know you're a war buff of sorts. I've been going back to the 1840s, Revolutionary War. I'm sure you probably researched that pretty well. I mean, so Vietnam. I mean, is that something you've looked at, or are you basically sticking to the 1800s?
Vietnam is still a fresh wound to me, and I have not started investigating that much in terms of learning what I should learn. I did not get drafted at that time, and there's a part of me that feels that I have an unpaid debt, but I've tried to repay my debt in other ways.
Well, and I will go along with that in very much way is the tribute you've given to the war heroes and people, and not necessarily just war heroes, people that just the unknown people that have participated in wars. There's a lot to be said for that. I mean, so what you've done may far exceed any being on any battlefield anywhere.
Well, I humbly disagree, but I think there are different ways to contribute, and while I still feel that perhaps I should have done something else, once I did not get drafted, that's when I decided I would go on to medical school. So I think I have partially made up for that unpaid debt.
Well, like I said, in this museum alone, I know I'm looking around right now, the enlisted uniforms, officer uniforms, Japanese flags, American flags, the video of Hal Moore back there. There's just so much history. So how can you take it all in?
You can't. You can't. The history is one of the things where for every one thing you learn, you bring up 10 other questions, and you never understand it all. But as you and I have talked about in private before, it is incumbent on us as American citizens to understand our history, because, as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun, and human nature always repeats itself. And if we don't know where we have been and how we got there, we're going to go back and do it all over again.
I totally agree with that. And the world has been marked. Basically, you can mark the world by wars. I mean, you can go back and say, and you talk about whether it's a war that went on in ancient history or a war that goes on today. That's basically how we mark our history.
It absolutely is. In my particular profession, most of the major medical advances that have been made in the last 500 years have been instigated by armed conflict. Mm-hmm. Whether it's the development of antibiotics or the use of IV fluids or new surgical techniques, all of those have evolved out of wartime surgery.
Well, again, are you still looking for artifacts?
Always. Always.
So it's still a bug that you're going to have for many, many years?
Always. My collecting has boiled down to, if it's cheap and it makes me go, ooh, I'm going to bring it home.
How do you recognize an artifact? Like, say, this uniform here, how did you distinguish that from being an actual artifact from being a costume that somebody to come up with just to rent out for the day?
Well, I am not the expert like Mr. Munson and Mr. Harrison are, but there are things that you can look at, particularly this uniform. You look at the stitch work on it, and you can tell that it's hand done. It's irregular. It doesn't have the absolute perfect stitch pattern that a machine-made item would have. There are other things that you can do using UV light, or like Mr. Harrison, Jack Harrison does, he can tell by smell.
Really?
Whether something's real or not.
Well, then my stuff must be great, because nothing's regular and it always smells bad. So I've probably got some great artifacts I'm putting together.
I'm sure you have.
Well, Doctor, I appreciate you stopping in here for a few minutes to show us a little bit of what's going on, because I know history is a big part of your life, and having a museum like this is so important that we want to pass this on to future generations, and I guess we're a little bit scared we'll forget about it.
We are, and for those of us that collect these artifacts for the historical purposes, we understand that we don't own these things. We're merely the caretakers for the next generation. Yeah. Certain things need to be preserved as a reminder of what the cost has been to develop this country.
Well, we thank you for allowing some of your stuff to be here and allowing the world to share, because history's great if you got it in your back room or in your basement, but to allow other people to share in it, that's tremendous.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
All right, well, Dr. Mickey Anderson here. Appreciate you stopping in here today, and appreciate you tuning in today and talking to us a little bit about what's going on at the Civil War Museum and the Museum of the other wars that we have here as well, here in downtown Bardstown. And we want to thank Mr. Bob Llewellyn, the curator, for allowing us to spend a few minutes in the museum today, and we invite you to stop in as well, because you'd be fascinated. I don't care if you know anything about history or don't know anything about. When you walk out of this building, you'll be smarter than you did when you come in. Just put it that way. So for all of us here at Channel 6, we'll stick around. A lot more to come on Community Focus. This is Kenny Fogle saying so long. Have a great evening.